So please join me in welcoming to the screen, Dr. Chuck Stecker.
Sid, thank you, buddy. Well, as Sid said, he and I have got a lot of years together. Got so much on my heart in so many different ways. The biggest question I'm going to ask you men today is, are you asking your church to be something that you're not willing to be a part of? Okay. And this is the reason I'm saying that is that as I've traveled and I've had one of the things that Sid didn't put in that, which is kind of interesting. I'm going to digress for just a second to show you how crazy I really am. Since I saw you men last year, in August of last year, at the end of July, first week of August, a church that my wife and I had attended for about 16 years. And then about 6 years ago, God led us to basically a church plant. They'd been there for about 4 years, I guess, about 8 minutes from our house. And we just felt that there was a time of change coming and so forth. But last August, first part of August, the church that we had been a part of for 16 years, the elders gave the pastor there an opportunity to take his gifts and calling and excel someplace elsewhere. Was that delicate and sensitive enough for you men down there? Right? So them being without a pastor, tell you how crazy they were. They reached out to me and asked if I would step in as an interim pastor. And we know the word interim, that if you ever go to a church and somebody says, here's our interim pastor, rarely are people going to stick around till they see what the church is going to do later, before they make any commitment. So very rapidly, that got transformed over to me being the teaching pastor at Summit Church in Centennial. Sid's been at that church long before I was serving there. For a lot of things, Sid's got his hand in about 43 different things here in the Colorado area in any event. So there was a lot of things going on at the church there. But so in addition to the ministry, a small publishing company, trying to be a husband, a father, a grandfather, a great-grandfather, some of those things. Now I'm the teaching pastor at Summit Church in Centennial, Colorado. Stepped into that. And one of the things that matched up very well, as one of the elders told at one of the information meetings, and I wasn't there, but they said, why Chuck Stecker? That's always a great question. And one of the elders spoke up, who happens to be a good friend, but and on the board of our ministry, he said, well, there was a number of things, but one of the things was the things that Chuck and the ministry have been teaching across the country and 12, 15 other countries are the things that we want in this church, which is intergenerational and the community of becoming intergenerational. And so that was a real great opening. We didn't know. They asked me to be available till the end of the year. That ended in December. I guess I misunderstood the ending of what year. Now we're committed till the end of 2023 at the church. And just for perspective, for all you young guys out there, I'm 75. I'll be 76 here in a few months. And I told him I'm not auditioning for a job in any way, but certainly want to try to bring integrity, full transparency, and full accountability from the leadership level at the church. And we're making a lot of progress in some areas, but there's a great work to be done, let me tell you. So I throw that part out. I want to just start off with an example. Several years ago, a good friend of mine, we had served in the military together, and it was crazy. Although we were different branches, he was armor, then aviation. I was infantry and mostly special ops out here. But our careers just constantly came back together and became more than just, hey, an acquaintance that we see again and so forth. I was actually driving his car the night I met my wife. He was medically retired out of the military, lived in New Jersey, and for many years, my wife and I, as we went to the DC area, whatever, we would swing up and spend a week there with him. On one of the first occasions, he said, have you ever been down to the boardwalk in Jersey? And I said, no. And I get down to, he said, we're going tomorrow. Well, he'd had a gambling addiction, and his picture was there, so he couldn't gamble. So he took his girlfriend, and she would gamble, and he would stand behind her and tell her what to bet. That was interesting. But in any event, at the boardwalk with all the casinos there and everything, it was a Tuesday. And one of the things that struck me as we drove into Park was the lineup of buses that had come in. Some of you young guys may not know, but Jersey is the retirement home for all the New York people. And I mean, literally, all of these retirement, probably 70% of them are people out of New York that have worked, retired, sold their places there, and then they could take all of that and move to a small, far less expensive retirement community, you know, in the Jersey area. And so here's all of these buses lined up. And we go in through the casino there. And what I saw and what my wife saw was so disturbing to us that literally we couldn't stay in the casino. We weren't betting, we weren't gambling. We thought, well, we're going to see the boardwalk and everything. But what we saw was so disturbing. We looked at each other and we said, we got to get out of here. And what it was that disturbed us so much was the wealth of a nation. And that to me would be the Encore generation. A lot of you men that I'm looking at in this room and on the screen here, and I'll explain a little bit more about the Encore and that, but the reality of it is we're looking at this wealth of a nation who are told to retire, have retired. That's not even a word in the Bible, by the way, but in any event, so many are there and primarily at the slot machines. Those are a lot different than when I went to Vegas as a young guy years ago, you know, where you actually pulled the handle and you had to, money was transferred onto a specific debit card that they had for that casino, and they had them on their little chains and they just plug them in, and that had all of their money on it there that they had transferred over. And they would just punch a button here to put how much they were wagering. Then they would punch a button and it would spin, tell them how much they lost. And they were literally sitting in front of those machines. The best I can say is just catatonic. There was no emotion. There was no reactions, whether they won or lost. There was nothing there. And it literally made me sick to see such a world of experience that is so desperately needed in the world that's coming apart right before our very eyes right now. And if you don't think this world is coming apart, I just read a statistic of a study that was done that literally in the United States, almost 80% of the people believe that you can be a good person and a moral person without believing there's a God. Right on the heels of that survey showed that 10 years ago, 1 in 10 high school students claimed to be in the LGBT, WXYZ, I don't know, the alphabet soup. 1 in 10 years ago. Survey done this school year, 1 in 4. That's where our nation's going with the, you know, all of the things that are happening. Now, I tell you that we're not going to talk politics. We're not going to talk that. But I want to impress upon you how desperately needed you are. How desperately needed you are. And I come back on that following day, my wife and I, we'd never seen anything on Broadway, any of the shows. And he says, we're going there tomorrow. And we went in and it was a Broadway show. We saw our first one. It was Mamma Mia. It was absolutely insane. The contrast between the cemetery that we had seen the day before at the casino and what was going on, the laughter, the everything. But here's the thing that got me. There was a huge number of people there that were there with their children, but the ones that grabbed me was this incredible number of people that was there with their grandchildren. And the conversations, the laughter, the experiences, and everything that was taking place. And my mind kept going back to the casino and then over here. And I'm going, you know, there's some people that are getting it. And there's some people that everything inside of them has been suppressed and been told it's no longer valid. And they're not useful in this world. And the generations coming up don't need them. And that is an absolute lie from hell. It is. I tell people if it smells of smoke, it's not coming from heaven. just a fact. And so this idea that God's telling us that we are to be generational legacy leaders. And so what I mean is, I'll just give you a couple of things. We get this issue of legacy and legend mixed up. And so many of and let me just pause and tell you, the encore, I don't like the term seniors. I'm not a real fan of the, whatever some church has, the over the hill, under the hill, around the hill. I don't know what those are. All of these other terms that we give people thinking how encouraging it is, when it basically just said, you're done, step to the side. You know, you can stay here in the church and we want you to pay here in the church. But when it comes to all these younger people, we don't want to really let you play with them. You know what I mean? And that's just not true. And it goes against everything that God has told us and everything God continues to tell us about how desperate. And so this has happened. And I tell you, the encore is what I really feel. And you guys, I just said, I'm 75. I'm pastoring a church, trying to lead them. I know, and it sounds crazy. I guess I should be down there with you all, living someplace and playing golf. Not that good at golf, so I better work on some other things. But the point on this is that it goes against everything God says. And the encore, to me, is really where we're at. And I look at all of you, and the question is, what are you going to do in your encore? He said, well, I didn't know I had one. Well, of course, because Satan doesn't want you to know that. But, you know, I may have shared this before. My wife and I and our son and a grandson had the privilege of seeing Andre Bocelli in concert. And one of the things that happened was he had 3 encores. And when you think about an encore, great performers, they're ready for the encore. They know what they're going to do in the encore. It might have been something they've already done, but they realize this is probably what they're going to be remembered for. And I remember being, you know, in other concert with Michael McDonald of the Doobie Brothers. And then one of the things he cut out, and this probably doesn't mean anything to you young guys, but then he cut a couple of CDs, but it was all a remake of the Motown songs that he sang. I remember sitting there listening, and then I'm listening to the people as they left, and everybody was singing his last song. The last song that he sang was so ingrained that there were all of these others were great, but the one that they left is when he got through, and I think he did 3 encores. Andre Bocelli did 3 encores. And my encouragement to you guys is, you know, are you asking your church to do something, change a generation, impact a generation, and not be willing to be a part of that? Do you not realize that God's got you in the greatest season of your life? And I call it the encore, but you got to be ready for it. And we've got to be ready to engage. And God's told us throughout his word that that's what he wants for us. And that's what he's prepared us for. And I look as I would go back constantly to that image that I had at the casino and on the boardwalk there in Jersey. And I just go, the wealth of a nation is what Satan is trying to separate from those where they can have the greatest impact. That's how it works. And you know, it's a simple thing. Sid and I, as he said, we get together, Original Pancake House, OPH. I'll get a text from Sid, said I'm in town, okay, and he'll give me dates, and you know, we got our time, and it's the OPH, and they kind of know us there, okay? Don't have the same server each time, just some great people. But one of the things, and I throw this out, I'm not trying to bring, you know, shine light and try to be the hero of every story, but you know, Sid and I we've done it since we've known each other, and I started back in 1996. And I say the same thing to our server. We're going to pray and ask the Lord to bless our food and our time together. Can we pray for you? We've never had a single person turn us down at OPH. Most of them have stood there and said, absolutely. We've had occasions where another server heard it, knows us, and will step over at the same time. And we'll always ask them, what can we pray for? Included in the prayer with whatever it is for them, Sid and I will always pray for them, that God will provide for them, bless them, meet their every need, take care of their families. And then many, many times they're going to give us something else. Would you pray for my mother? Would you pray for my son? And, you know, remember the one, she's got 2 teenagers, and you talk about needing prayer. And so walking through this, but it's interesting. And when we get through, and Sid and I'll fight for the check and so forth, and whoever's got it. I can tell you this, and again, the tip is generally, let me rephrase, the tip is always more than what a normal tip would be. And Sid and I both carry the mentality that we can't ask God to do something for someone if we're not willing to be a part of the solution. Just that simple. And I would ask you guys, think about this. The things that you're praying for our nation, the things that you're praying for your children, your grandchildren, the things that you're praying for your church, are you willing to be a part of the solution? Because I'm just saying, if you're praying for God to do something, but you're pulling back and you're not willing to be a part of the solution, are you really missing God's heart on that thing? And so that's why, and I know it sounds crazy. It's not an enormous amount of money whenever Sid and I tip them, but it's one that says this is a little bit more than, they know that because we prayed for God to provide for them. And Sid and I both will tell you, we feel that if we're asking God to do something for our nation, for our church, for our family, everything, that we've got to be available for God to use us to be a part of that solution. So I want to give you some scriptures on this and just kind of support some things. Actually use a Bible here. I got a couple of them out here. I got the NIV out here, and I've also got, Gene Getz got me onto the CSB version of the Bible, and he's got two different Bibles that Gene has come out with. One of them is the Life Essentials Bible. And if you haven't seen this, it's pretty extraordinary. Let me show you something here. You guys can all see this. This is the Life Essentials Bible. But what you're going to see through this is these QR codes. Gene spent 7 years teaching the Bible week after week. And the Holman Publishing Company took all of that and those videos and those QR codes. Gene identified life essentials for us. To be a life essential, it had to appear 3 times in the Bible. It had to be in both the Old and New Testament. And so every time there's a life essential in the Bible here, it's identified with his teaching, his writing on it, but a QR code, and you just hit that with your phone and you get Gene Getz teaching you for anywhere from 5 to 8 minutes on that subject. And it is absolutely extraordinary. Gene just turned 90 in March, and he's entering into, he came through a season, was in the hospital, and they called his family in, say goodbye, you're done. And Gene walked out of there and engaged in greater projects and so forth. So one publisher asked him to rewrite one book that he's doing. And in the book, the CSB, just like he did in the Life Essentials, he put a book out where he did the same thing throughout the Bible for men of character. And boy, if you want a great Bible to grab onto, he doesn't have the QR codes in him. It's got the place for him because COVID hit and stuff like that. So he's going back through and he's teaching on all of these, and they'll have a video, but you can still get the Bible. But in any event, Gene got me on the CSB, version, ESV, and I just encourage you guys, just be a student of the word. But I'm going to go to Deuteronomy. Y'all know this, but it's chapter 6, and it's starting in verse 6. These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home, when you walk down the road, when you lie down, when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads and write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. We know those scriptures, don't we, guys? It's, Deuteronomy, it starts in verse 6 and goes down to verse 9. And that idea, teach them to your children. They've got to be first, but here's the steps. Get this. What God says the step of this is it's got to be on our heart. And I go back to Jeremiah 31:31, and when Jeremiah says that he's going to give us, God says, I will give you a new covenant. It won't be like the old covenant. And that's in 31:31. You can read it. Whoever's walking there, I'm getting dizzy. Just enjoy this. No, I'm kidding. And bottom line is, the idea that he says, I will give you a new covenant. I will write my laws on your heart and your mind. In Philippians, then God says, I will give you a peace that passes all understanding. And Guard your heart and mind. So God's telling us throughout the Bible, his word, everything, our heart, our mind. And he starts this off in Deuteronomy and says, look, this is what I give you to be upon your hearts. And guys, that tells me first, we've still got to be students of the word. I don't care how many times you've read the Bible. I don't care how many Bible studies you've been through and how many times you've been at this thing. You're not done until God calls you home. And he's telling us this again, okay? Write them there. But, you know, in my legacy scriptures that God gave me when our granddaughter was born, Ellie, back in, 1998, as, in Psalm 78. And he tells us the same thing here. It's a generational piece. And he says in Psalm 78, verse 5, he says, he decreed the statutes for Jacob, established the law in Israel. Get this, which he commanded the forefathers to teach their children. So there's a two-step process. Man, we got to be students of the word. We got to know what God is saying, okay? And we can't cherry pick scriptures to support our political views or what we want to use this and that. We've got to be students of the word, Old Testament, New Testament. It's a big book. It's a good book, but let's use the whole thing. And so he comes through and he says he commands us to teach what we're supposed to know and have on our hearts, so the next generation would know them, even children yet to be born. And I love that. I speak a lot just on the issue of generations yet to be born. And that's what we're trying to do at Summit Church while I'm there. They in turn would tell theirs. And then there's three things: that they would put their trust in God, would not forget his deeds, and would keep his commands. And God is saying that we're to trust, remember, and obey the living God. And he gives us that, okay? He pours that out to us there. And all of that through this generation, the next. But guys, let me just tell you, I see so much of what's going on in our churches, and we've got parents and grandparents that are asking the church to do something with their kids and grandkids that they're not engaged in fully. And I love the church, and I know the responsibility, and I feel the great responsibility that I have as the teaching pastor at a church now, and what I'm supposed to be doing there. But the biggest thing that we're trying to do is empower people to take responsibility for their faith. And I tell them, I just want them to be able to do that on all the days that end in Y. I'll give Satan the rest of them. But all the days that end in the letter Y, I want those for God. And I want us to stand up for those, okay? And you say, just this idea that what we're supposed to do and trust, remember, and obey the living God. We've got to be the encore generation that realize, I believe this is what we're going to be remembered for. I do. I look back, and I know Sid said, yeah, I served in the military. I have hardly any relationships from the military. I came out of there and so forth, and I'm trying to think, a couple, but everything in my life has been through the process of what God's doing in this season of my life. Really since 1994, and the relationships there. And I'm coming up on, a bunch of years in vocational ministry. And I'm looking at the relationships. I'm going, what would I be remembered for? And I'm going to give you a statement here, though, so we don't get too hung up on what we're going to be remembered for. And as I studied this issue of legacy, and I really feel like we get it confused, and this is a whole nother teaching, but I just want to give you just a quick line on this thing that really has kind of helped guide me on some things. And that is that we get hung up on this issue of legacy when really most people are talking about their legend. A legend is what you want people to remember about you when you're dead. A legacy is what you want people to remember about God because you lived. Just let it soak in for a second. A legend is what you want people to remember about you when you're dead. But a legacy is what you want people to remember about God because you lived. And I think about that. There's so many things in my mind right now. Fortunately, you guys don't have any place to go till noon, do you? I mean, we're pretty good with this time. Okay, I got it. All right, that's my next appointment. So I got to quit 10 minutes before noon so I can get another cup of coffee. All right. But I remember one of my favorite movies is Secondhand Lions. And I've got 3 copies. I've got one upstairs TV, one near our bedroom TV, and then I got one in the safe in case of nuclear war. I mean, this is something you got to have, as a copy of Secondhand Lions. But there's a very, very significant part at the very end. And the young guy that's kind of the adopted son, but somebody comes up and he says, so, wow, these guys really lived? And he goes, oh, yeah, they really lived. And I think about that. I want that for me, and I want that for my kids and my grandkids and people. And they said, so did Chuck really live? I want my kids to be able to say, and my grandkids to be able to say, and the people that know me, oh yeah, he lived. He really lived. But for what purpose? And the purpose is living, the legacy part is what people will know about God because I lived. For my children, my grandchildren, and that. And you have to ask yourself that question, guys. Most of you guys there, I have a huge respect for all of you. You've done a lot with your lives. And I know this in conversations from being there with you. Guys, just seeing Sid. I mean, when I first met Sid, he was on the board of directors of a small ministry that was just getting started called Promise Keepers. President on the board of Quiet Waters, and everything I touched with him. And Sid and I talked just 30 minutes before this started, so Sid could pray over me and get me ready for this. And said, oh, by the way, Wednesday I'm in town. You're going to the next week. I want you to go to the prayer luncheon with me. And he's a major part. So I know these things, and I know it's just like the rest of you guys. You guys have done so much with your lives. And the fact that I believe that God has blessed you in that process. It doesn't mean it hasn't been without struggles. But I'm really asking you, what are you going to do with the rest of your life? What are you going to do with it? I saw Top Gun Maverick for the 3rd time. I was on an airplane and I just threw up my iPad, threw in my AirPods. It's kind of cool when I'm in the second half of my 70s now. And I got this technology, and young people are just crazy thinking I even know how to use these things. You pull out your AirPods, you put them in, you're doing this. And it was amazing. Young people across the island that were sitting down, and they kind of stared at me like, holy cow, what are you going to do with that? Right. So I was able to watch this and so forth. And the idea of Maverick, and that Top Gun piece of this thing. Well, I go back, the original one was about 30 years ago, 30 years ago, 3 decades. I have a good friend that flew many of the flights. He was a Top Gun instructor there. And I can give you his name. You guys may want him to come on one of these things. Amazing guy named Tom Joyce. But Tom was in the Pentagon when the plane hit, and he was the executive officer to the director of naval operations in the Pentagon. And the plane hit the worst part was the naval operations. They suffered the worst casualties and everything. But Tom tells the story. He just got back from a run, and he'd opened up a bag of Doritos. And this, just a sidebar story for you. He's got the bag of Doritos. The plane hits the Pentagon. The floor buckles. Everything's happening. He is literally flying through the air in slow motion, and the Doritos are out of the bag. And you know what people say, what was your thoughts just before? And, you thought, what were your last words in this? And Tom tells the story. He says, I'm flying literally through the air. I'm looking up, and there's my Doritos. And people say, what were you thinking, Tom, when the plane hit? He says, I'm flying through the air looking at them, and I'm never going to be able to eat those Doritos, am I? True story. But in any event, he was a Top Gun pilot there. And when he got through and the plane hit, and he was also one of the elders at a church, ended up leaving the Navy and becoming a pastor there, spent several hours and getting the calls there. They get on the road coming down 95 and that. It's just, 20,000 people and the ones that get out of there. And he had to go see some families whose husband and father wasn't coming back that day, and that had been the naval operations and so forth. But he gets through and he gets home. He'd already called his family, his sons, dad, daughter, wife, and he walks in, and his son was a high school senior, and he was sitting there kind of in the family room, and Tom came in, a big strapping kid, football player, and he gets up, and neither one of them say anything, and they both grab each other. And Tom said there were tears, and they're just holding each other. And then his son stepped back away from him. And all he said was, so now what are you going to do with the rest of your life? You know what? The things going on in our nation right now, the tragedies that are taking place just in education and the lives of these young people, all of the other stuff. Isn't that a great question for all of us, guys? What are we going to do with the rest of our lives? And we got some choices. Roll over, quit, make that somebody else's responsibility, and blame others for the condition of the world. I mean, we got those choices. Or in the small world, whatever God's given us, we can make a difference there and choose to be engaged, realizing that every day God has given you, it's really for his purposes, for his legacy. And what will people remember about God because each of you men lived? Isn't that the real question? People ask, they said, I'm not, a seminary and I go through all of this stuff. I'm going to kind of give you a story here that this happened years and years and years ago for me. My gosh, it had to be probably about 18 years ago, which is a long time for most of us, isn't it? In any event, I'm there to speak at a pastor's luncheon, small group. We're in a barbecue place and catfish and all of that, peanuts and pickles and so forth. And as I'm sitting there getting ready to speak, pastor comes in and sits down next to me, introduced myself and so forth. And so I asked him, so you pastor? And he said, yeah. Gave me the name of the church, hadn't heard of it, talked about it. And I said, so, we always ask, so how big is your church? What are you doing? He'd been there and it was less than 70. He said, probably running about 60 people. I said, it's interesting. I've learned since then that there's a ministry called 495 Network. And it's because and 90% of the churches in America, take away the Catholic and the Roman Catholic and the Greek Orthodox, are under 500, 90%. 80% are under 200 and 70% are under 100. That's the place. Not quite like the church. I mean, most churches in America are about the size of the guys in, the number of people in the room right there, and so forth. But in any event, so we're talking, he says, yeah, he said he just buried his mother the day before. Holy cow. He's at a pastor's luncheon and the day before he just buried his mother. And there was something in his voice and it was very, very significant. It wasn't this pain, yes, but there was a great joy in his life and talked about it. And I'm going, wow, tell me about the funeral, because there was something there. And he talked about how starting with the wake and everything else. And at the wake, 2 nights before, he said, in addition to the entire family there were 14 different pastors that had ministered to their family, and particularly the mother and father. Mother had passed, father had gone several years earlier. And all 14 of them were there and the house was filled and the whole family and so forth. And he says, yeah, the entire family was there. And I said, the family, so tell me, 21 children, 17 of them were still living at the time. And he gives me, I wrote this down on a piece of paper after he told me, I didn't even repeat it. And this is 18 years ago. I don't know what the numbers are now. There were 43 grandchildren and 51 great grandchildren. And then he made a casual statement. He goes, the funny part is we're all in ministry. Kind of listened to that. I looked at him, I said, you mean the children, the 17 remaining children? He goes, no, not just my brothers and sisters and me, all of us. I go, wow. I said, you mean your grandchildren? And then before I could ask, he goes, yes, and the great grandchildren. So we did the numbers on this thing. The family numbered 111 at that point. 17 children, 43 grandchildren, 51 great grandchildren. All of those 111 and the ones, they all came with, now that didn't include the spouses. Okay. So add to the numbers. And they're all gathered there for the funeral for his mother. And I'm saying to myself, families don't gather like that. That's not normal. There's always some that can't make it and so forth. And I've got a good friend here. His sister-in-law died, and he's a lot younger than I am. He's in his mid-60s. He's just a kid to most of us, isn't he? But in any event, he's got two older brothers in North Dakota and one in Michigan, and sister-in-law in Michigan just died. And he's going up to drive an 85-year-old brother. The other one can't even make it. You know, so you look at the age as we get older, that sometimes families don't gather like that. And so I went back to this issue that they were all in ministry. And he goes, yeah. And I said, every single one of them? He goes, yeah, absolutely. From pastors to missionaries to lay leaders to evangelists to worship leaders. And he says, and all of the kids are involved as well. And I asked him, I said, you know, he said this like he was ordering a pizza. You know what I'm saying? It was just casual conversation. I said, wow, what church did your dad pastor? Was he a minister in that? And he kind of laughed and he goes, no, my dad was a vegetable farmer in South Louisiana. I said, a vegetable farmer. And he said, yeah. And I said, how is it? And he goes, I don't know. He says, well, let me just tell you. He says, here's what we remember. Every Saturday morning, my dad would load up the wagon drawn by horses with all of the vegetables that we had. But before we left, all of us kids would get around and there were paper bags and he would have us fill these with vegetables because he knew every pastor of every denomination along the route that we drove to market. And as he drove, regardless of the weather, rain, shine, whatever, in front of each house of a pastor, he would stop. And one of us kids would run a bag of vegetables up, put it at the door, run back, get on the wagon, because we had to get to market. I said, holy cow. He said, but then when we finished selling all of our vegetables, we didn't have fruit. So Dad would buy fruit. And he would fill bags, the same number, by the way. And on the way home, we would do the same thing in reverse. One of us kids would jump out and we would put a bag of fruit at each pastor's door and got home. And I asked him about that. And he said, you know, Dad didn't have to tell us what he valued. We saw it in his life, what he truly valued, regardless of what he said. And he said, you know, when us kids saw what Dad valued in his life, all of us kids apparently decided that's what I want to be. And so I've thought about that, and I've thought about my own life, you know, and I look at that, and I just left Virginia. I've got two grandsons there and a granddaughter that finished college there. Do my kids see the same value in my life as a vegetable farmer in South Louisiana of what I say I believe in God? I don't know. You know, I can ask them, I guess. But here's what I do know. I'm not done. I'm not done. And this idea of being around my kids, my grandkids, and their friends. And by the way, when I was down there with you guys, all of you, I got to have dinner with our granddaughter that was at Grand Canyon. And she had assembled this group of people that included, and she made dinner. And there was her two roommates and three guys. Ended up talking to them for over an hour after dinner, but mostly the guys. And it was interesting. It was just asking them what they felt that God wanted to do with their lives. What are their dreams? And I've had this statement that rattles in my head for years and years. And I know, you know, I took part of it from the great theologian Edgar Allan Poe and some of the others, you know, but this is mine. There are those who dream by night, but beware of us who dream by day, for we will change the world. And I would ask all of you guys, are you still dreaming by day for what you want and believe God can do with you, through you? Are you still dreaming by day for your kids and your grandkids? Or have we left that to somebody else? I believe that God's calling us to be obedient. I want to share one last story on obedience. 1917, a guy got all fired up in the United States, but he was of German descent, named Louis Graf. Louis Graf wanted to go back to Germany. By the way, in Germany right now, that same thing that said almost 80% of the people in Germany right now, 90% of the people in Germany don't believe you need to believe in God just to be a good person. That's where it's at right now. And he gets into his car and he's driving to a place where he's supposed to speak and he wants to share Jesus. He's I guess we would call him a layman. I guess we would call him a businessman. But he wanted to take everything that God had blessed him with, and he wanted now just to devote his life to make sure people knew about Jesus. And he goes back to Germany. He's driving through this town. There's no GPS, 1917. There's no GPS. He doesn't have an iPhone. Certainly doesn't have the car that many of you have that's got the map in it. He's apparently lost, and he stops in front. A local baker comes out. It's one of those, "You're not from here, are you?" And he said, "No." And he asked him about a town or a direction. And the baker tells him, you're lost. You're way off where you said you wanted to go. And he's standing there. He's outside the car and everything. And he hears a man crying, though, in pain. He says, "Who is that?" The guy said, "That's old August. He's been in pain for years and years." And we hear him crying out in pain. And Louis Graf says, "Can I pray for him?" He says, "Sure, whatever." There's a young boy right there, and he sends him up and he says, "Go tell August there's a man out here that wants to pray for him for healing," and see what he says. And the kid comes back and he says, "Yeah," he says, "Come on up." Louis Graf goes up there, and here's this guy that's just wrenched in pain. He's in bed. He can hardly get out of bed. And he starts praying for him, and he lays hands on him, and he starts praying for him. And when he got through, the man was able to get up out of bed and walk and healed. And then Louis Graf led him to the Lord. This guy had a son. His son's standing there, and he's seeing it. And with his dad, he comes and he sees this, and his dad, August, accepts the Lord, makes a decision, absolutely changed his life. His son made a decision. And 15 years later, there's a grandson. And now the whole family, seeking the Lord, have made decisions. And the grandson's born 15 years after August Reinke. August was born. And the grandson's name is Reinhard Bonnke. And even the latest numbers show that nearly 80 million people have come to Christ because of his preaching and his teaching. And I think about this. It starts with a guy that thought he was lost, and he was. But in that moment, there was an opportunity. And a grandfather gets healed, comes to know the Lord, his son and a grandson. And through the life of the grandson, God uses him, preaches the gospel primarily across Africa. And people say nearly 80 million people have come to know Christ. There's so many great stories. But here's what I want to just kind of leave you with, in a sense. I know what God's kind of challenging me on. I got a lot of years ahead of me. Some of the guys, even when I was there with you and Sid and I've talked, and I've asked people they say, "How can we pray for you?" I put a guy on an airplane on Monday, flew to New Zealand to see his grandkids. And every time he's with me and every time I get a note, he says, "I'm praying the spirit of Caleb for you," just like you asked. We're standing in front of the airport at DIA, and he held me in his arms. I held him in his arms, and I prayed for him. He's going to see a granddaughter that's 8 months, never held her, see her on Zoom, and then another granddaughter and a grandson there. As I prayed for him for his trip and the travels and everything, he began to pray for me, and he asked God to continue to pour out the spirit of Caleb over me. Spirit of Caleb is simply this: as Caleb, went into the desert at 40, came out at 80, but it didn't end there, because it wasn't until he was 85. He had helped Joshua take the other 11 tribes into the promised lands that they had, but he was the leader of the tribe of Judah, from which we get the Lion of Judah, from the root of David, the Christ child. 85, he says, I'm as strong now as we went into the land of spies. Here's a great statement: give me my mountain. Give me my mountain. But he still had to, once released into the land that was promised to the tribe of Judah, history tells us it was 5 more years that he had to fight all of the ites that were there to actually take possession of the land. I'll be 76 here this year. I know there's some of you that are younger, some are older. But I would just say, are you praying for the spirit of Caleb, or are you done? Are you the over the hill gang or the under the hill gang, or are you in your encore? Are you praying for God to do something in your family, in your church, that you're not willing to be a part of the solution in some small way? And by the way, these kids are desperate for older men to sit, tell their story, and listen to their stories. They're desperate for them. I sat with one of the young guys on our staff that's not even 30, shared his heart. We went 2.5 hours yesterday, and he says a couple of things. He says, I know God's put this on my heart. He said, but Chuck, I don't know how to do this, and I need help. And I think we've got a generation of young people coming up. And by the way, I'm not just talking about high schoolers or college. Breakfast on on Monday, right after I had an early morning session at our church with guys, I went right, and he's a spiritual son, and he's 63 years old, and just walking through processes of life there. So look, some of you guys, the target that God may have for you might be the guys in their 50s, those young kids. Might be some of the guys in their 40s. I don't know what God's got for you, but I guess the question I would leave: are you focused on what people will remember about you when you're dead? Are you really wanting to focus on what people will remember about God because you lived? That's really the question. I'm honored. I'm blessed just to be able to see you on the screens, guys. Looking forward to an opportunity to be back down in that beautiful area that you live in, or you're in right now down there. Don't know when that'll be, but I'll keep Sid and all of you informed if I can ever get back in that area. But I just want to say, you know what? Let me just speak the blessing and the spirit of Caleb over you. You're not done. And when you realize you're in that encore, and this is what you're going to be remembered for this season, and what are you going to do with it? So, Father, I just ask right now, pour out your spirit, pour out your blessings, pour out your favor, your wisdom, and discernment on this wealth that you've got right now on the screen, in the room together, and in different places. I speak the spirit of Caleb over them to give them the strength that they need to move forward powerfully, that their focus would be, what will people remember about you, Father, because we lived? And I ask this in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. Guys, thank you. I appreciate the time with you. I really do. Love being with you. And I told Sid and Marcia when she came on, said, are you available? I said, the answer for these guys right here is always yes, and yes again, and then we'll just work out the details. How's that? Okay. All right. God bless you. Any comments, questions? I think we actually finished before the 8 o'clock time for you. Or as you guys finish up there. Okay. Any thoughts, questions? I got one right here. Tim, are you raising your hand? You're on mute, Tim. There you go. No, still on mute.
Mute. There it is. Okay,
There it
I
is,
just want to
buddy.
say
There
thanks a
you
lot. It's funny. I was talking to some other people in our group. Some of us attended a birthday this past weekend for a friend of ours that used to attend this Bible study, and certainly a man of God. He's a great guy. And he turned 80. And I looked around, I said, man, everybody at this birthday party's old. And I realized I was at the party. So I'm going, well, I guess that's me. So I'm 74. And I've been going through, you're talking to me, I've been going through trying to figure out what I'm going to do next. I've been doing a whole lot of political stuff for a long time now. And it's just not enough. And the God part of it isn't enough that's in it. So thank you for stimulating me personally today. It's been great to have you. Thank you so much for being here.
Hey, Tim, if you'll send me a mailing address, I'll send you a copy of the book. If you passed your baton, take it back. I'll sign it for you. And say, hey, guys, anybody that's on here, let me just tell you, if you're on here and you don't have a copy of the book, if you passed your baton, take it back. You remember that when you pass the baton, you got to quit running, get off the track, and you're done. You're out of the race. And I'm telling people, in fact, I've got a meeting here in about 3 hours with another ministry that wants to co-brand this seminar and the work that we're doing there. Tim, if you're in that thing, you send me, just here, write it down real quick. DRC STECKER. DRC STECKER. That's my personal email @gmail.com. Okay. And you can go on to achosengeneration.org. You know, you hit message there, you'll get me all kind. Any of you guys, that's the email address. If you want a book, I'll sign it and send it to you. Okay. I'll invest with you. Fair enough.
Thank you.
Okay. Good. Thanks for your comment, Tim. I appreciate that. Anybody else comments before we sign off on this, I guess?
Just a real quick question. In being at this stage of life and reading the Bible over the lifetime, I can't find a retirement plan in the Bible other than going to heaven. Secularly, we're sold, to retire. So that's basically what you're saying. Am I incorrect or not?
Absolutely. There's nothing about passing the baton. We've got a ministry that was going to do a baton, say we got to pass the baton. I talked to him, and it's a different issue than passing the torch. And when you light somebody else's torch, you keep yours until God extinguishes it, but you light theirs as well. So God's saying to us, guys, we're not done. That if you think about anybody, light a fire, light a spark, and pass that on, but hang on to yours. Okay. And they did have a retirement ceremony in the Bible, by the way. You guys might have read that. I don't know if you did or not. Glorious retirement ceremony when it was appropriate. It's called a funeral. So think about that when you want a retirement party. Don't get that one too early if God's not done with you. Okay. All right. Any other comments, questions for me, guys?
Any other questions?
Thank you.
Guys, thank you. Like I said, anytime to be with you, it's an honor. I'm blessed. And the answer is always yes for you guys. And then we work out the details. All right. God bless you. Look forward to seeing you again. Tim, send me something, buddy. I'll mail it to you. All right. And anybody else, you got my email. All right. Bye now.